So Mr. Davis, did the board members come to an agreement of how we should present the history of the LBJ's Great Society to present to our teen youth group?
Yes, Mr. Smith, they have decided to create a LBJ's Great Society fair that will include the topics of war on poverty, the 1968 convention, and social history.
Do you mind giving me a preview on the information that you found?
Of course I don't mind. I had my assistant Emily do research on the LBJ's Great Society, and she said when the assassination of JFK happened it made Lyndon Baines Johnson move quickly to put himself in the office of the presidency. With him having 11 months before the election of 1964, it was his only chance to prove to America that he deserved to be president. And so it is said the LBJs sponsored the largest reform agenda since Roosevelt's New Deal. He was able to get two pieces of important legislation passed. It was the Civil Rights Bill and the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964. LBJ also declared a war on poverty. He wanted our country to build a great society that will get rid of poverty and racial injustice. And speaking about war on poverty, it was a campaign of legislation and social services that aimed to reduce or eliminate poverty in the USA. It started in 1964 and lasted until 1968 for the first term. The first term was introduced by LBJ during his State of the Union address on January 8, 1964. The reason why the legislation was designed to respond to poverty was because it affected 35 million Americans. During the campaign, the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 was signed on August 20, 1964. LBJ took more action into the poverty war by signing the Social Security Act of 1964. The war in poverty was LBJ's attempt to make himself a lasting remark for his term. The things that made LBJ struggle to make the war on poverty successful were that there was low income, lack of low-cost credit, lack of information, fraud and deception, legal exploitation, lack of public and social services, and lack of transportation. On March 16, 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson wrote Message on Poverty. An important part from that message is when he says, in working out a plan for this war on poverty, the approach at the local level was to be a community approach. This eventually was to be called community action, meaning that to achieve this war on poverty we must be able to do this as a community to get this done. And I did my research on the 1968 convention, and learned that this event stands as an important event in the nation's political and cultural history. It took place in Chicago from August 26 to the 29th. The purpose of the convention was to select a new nominee to run as the Democratic Party candidate for the office. Also, the year the convention was held, it was during a year of riots and violence in many cities. This was the same year as when Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy was assassinated. Lastly, the last topic that will be discussed is social history. The actual definition of social history is history that concentrates upon the social, economic, and cultural institutions. During the 1960s, the United States experienced a long period of economic expansion in history. In early 1963, inflation was stable, but unemployment was still too high at 5.7%. But in 1965, inflation began to pick up slightly, but the GNP grew by $9 billion and unemployment went from 5.7 to 4.1%. And that's basically it for what will be discussed at the fair.
Very good, Mr. Davis. I am impressed with the information that you have told me, and the children will definitely be able to take away some knowledge from learning this.
Thank you, Mr. Smith.
So like you said before, the LBJ's Great Society Fair will not only include LBJ's Great Society, but War on Poverty, the 1968 Convention, and social history. Is that right?
Yes, Mr. Smith. All of those topics will be discussed,
So when is this LBJ's Great Society Fair going to take place?
I believe it will be June 18th.
Very well. I leave tonight for a business trip and will be back a couple of days before the fair. So while I am gone, I am leaving you in charge to handle this event. If everything goes as planned, you Mr. Davis will be expecting a promotion and bonus.
Trust me, Mr. Smith, you will not be disappointed.